Welcome, Warriors. If you remember the live-action movie of Street Fighter, then you have to remember when it was made into two versions of a game. So, I played them, and this is my experience with them. Now, let's get into it. Well, crafting a live-action version of Street Fighter was a great idea, but creating a game based on it was not so great of an idea, because the movie bombed at the box office, and we all want to forget that we paid the entrance to see that catastrophe of a movie, am I right, fellow gamers? I believe that this game could not have arrived at a worse time for Capcom, as many gamers had grown weary of Street Fighter II's numerous upgrades. I didn't mind them at all, and had switched to another fighting game that was a bloody mess and unworthy of its popularity. Cough, Mortal Kombat cough, returning to Street Fighter only after Street Fighter Alpha was released. In any case, moving on to the game, Street Fighter. The movie, like that other bloody fighting game I mentioned above, uses real people as the fighters. We all saw that coming, but I don't think I want to see a motion-captured Ryu. It is probably better than the movie from which it was adapted. The majority of your favorites are represented among the combatants, including Ryu, Vega, Guile, Chun-Li, Bison, Sagat, Ken, Balrog, Zangief, Honda, and Cammy. Additionally, there is Akuma, who I don't get why they included because he wasn't even in the movie, but I will give the game some credit as this is the first game in which he wasn't a mystery character, and this time he also has a name. Additionally, Saanda, an army soldier who collaborated with Guile on the film, is present. Additionally, there is the Shadaloo soldier Blade, who was one among the troops that collaborated with Bison in the field, although I must commend the costume designer for making Blade's outfit work somewhat with Shadaloo and giving him that unidentified vibe. The gaming experience is mediocre. There are still fireballs, dragon punches, and other similar moves, and you get all of your favorite Street Fighter characters, but it doesn't feel like Street Fighter. However, just because Ryu and a few of the other characters are there, along with the special techniques, does not imply that the game is a Street Fighter one. In fact, I don't even think it's Street Fighter. Instead, I think it's just Mortal Kombat dressed up. Fighting the CPU is also inexpensive since they play expertly, and you could lose the first game. Don't you hate it when that happens? And avoid tossing your opponent at all costs since they will continue to throw counters at you in an effort to throw you back. I realize throwing is somewhat cheap, but counter throwing is much more so. I didn't anticipate this from Capcom. The Mortal Kombat fighters from the original game look better than the motion-captured ones, who are very ugly. If you thought Akuma was already ugly, you haven't seen him here since he looks awfully motion-captured. However, all the fighters do look like their movie equivalents, which might be either a good or a negative thing depending on how you look at it. With the exception of this one stage that was located within the movie's fenced arena, the surroundings are dull, and I didn't like for them. Graphically, nothing outstanding. Music? We don't require any annoying music. That's what the main sound man must have stated when he was planning the music, but I don't believe there was any music there, and even if there had been, I couldn't hear it. The voice samples are okay, but they sound strange when Ken uses Dragon rather than Shoryuken during his Dragon Punch. Hell, I could have opted for All-You-Can rather than plain old Dragon instead. This sound bites a lot. There includes some of the Super Street Fighter II turbo techniques as well as the familiar 6-button layout, and the special moves still call for the traditional movements. Throw counters were also added. I'm glad they didn't use this idea in future games because it is too cheap and the CPU uses throws excessively, although it does prevent you from using excessive throws, so I don't think there are people here who solely rely on throws. At least the control is in working order. I'm afraid not quite, but sort of. Maybe for a little while to see whether it's any good, but after that, things start to become worse. Because it was inspired by the Street Fighter movie, I believe the majority of people won't play this game any longer, but it's not quite as horrible as that, although that is really not saying much. Below average replay value. It's interesting to note that Capcom itself produced the home ports for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Capcom chose to completely recode the game engine for consoles, indicating that they were aware of how unplayable the arcade version had become. The digital character sprites were copied into the Super Street Fighter II Turbo engine by Capcom, but the graphics and music were totally altered to make everything brighter and easier on the eyes. DJ and Blanco were also added to the cast since previous video of the actors had been captured, but the developers of the arcade version of the game were unable to do so before the game's release. In many different ways, Capcom altered the game's aesthetic for the home ports, such as drawing over specific animation frames on sprites to more closely match the game's original character sprites from SF2. Additionally, every character's voice was totally redone, sounding much more like their original recordings and correctly pronouncing their special moves. The gameplay also included the addition of super moves and EX specials, which would subsequently be presented in Street Fighter III Second Impact to a greater extent. New backdrops and a generally brighter and more colorful aesthetic were also added to the console versions. Unfortunately, the home version did not include Blade or the Bison troops with the palette shift. The console versions of Street Fighter, the movie were, dare I say, an improvement over the original arcade version, with gameplay and a combination system that seems more like Street Fighter and less like a muddled-up bootleg version of Mortal Kombat. However, the game was still a colossal failure on consoles. It is known that some of the incredible technology's developers were actually big fans of Street Fighter and at least tried to make a good game, but due to technological constraints, poor timing, and poor gameplay design, the one and only live-action Street Fighter arcade game will stand alone as the franchise's biggest failure. On the plus side, it's one of the funniest and most offensive fighting games ever created. That has to count for something. Few devoted fans really wasted their time with this hideous-looking and awful game in 1995/96 since Street Fighter. The movie was a complete disaster at the box office. If I had to choose between this and the home console version of this game, the home versions were different from this. If you may recall, I would choose the arcade game mainly because it was at least somewhat entertaining compared to the board fest that was the home version, even though that does not necessarily make the arcade game superior. This game, in my opinion, is not even deserving of the moniker Street Fighter. If you must, try this game, but bear in mind that you have been forewarned. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video of Played and Reviewed. Until next time.